On February 14th, 1985, 22-year-old Terri McAdams was in her small apartment on Walnut Hill Circle in Arlington, Texas. She wasn't supposed to be alone that Valentine's Day. The UT Arlington student should have been celebrating with her fiancé, but he was out of town on business. So there she was, in their ground floor apartment on Walnut Hill Circle, preparing for his return the next morning. She'd planned everything perfectly, the heart-shaped cake cooling on the counter, and she'd even arranged to pick him up from the airport later that day. But Terri never made it to the airport. What happened that night would shake Arlington to its core. Sometime after dark on February 13th, someone slid open the glass door to her apartment. They came prepared for violence. The 22-year-old was found beaten to death and sexually assaulted inside her Arlington apartment. Her attacker had managed to enter the ground floor apartment through a sliding door, according to Arlington police. The scene was devastating. At the time, detectives said McAdams' engagement ring was taken during the attack. But this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. The level of violence suggested something much darker. Someone had targeted this young woman specifically, and they'd come prepared to kill. The maintenance worker who discovered her body the next morning was traumatized by what he saw. Terri lay there, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a perfect Valentine's Day. The heart-shaped cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, a cruel reminder of the life that had been so brutally cut short. Detectives threw everything they had at the case. They worked around the clock for months, following every lead, interviewing anyone who might have known something. Terri's parents even offered a reward, desperately pleading for someone, anyone, to come forward with information. But as the months turned into years, the case grew cold. The timing couldn't have been worse for the investigation. You have to understand the climate of fear that gripped North Texas in the mid-1980s. There was a string of young women disappearing and being found dead across the region. Authorities suspected a serial killer was on the loose, and Terri McAdams fit the profile perfectly. She was young, attractive, and lived alone. The randomness of it all terrified everyone. Terri herself had been scared. Her mother later told reporters that her daughter had been following news of the other disappearances obsessively. She'd even quit her job in Irving because she didn't want to drive home after dark. At night, especially when her fiancé was away, she'd become a recluse, rarely leaving the apartment even for groceries. She'd call her mother in Little Rock regularly, sharing her fears about what was happening to young women in the area. She was terrified, her mother Ann McAdams said. All the girls who disappeared or were killed were about her age, and they were young, pretty girls. So naturally, being that far from home in a strange town, and something like that going on, you would be afraid. Despite all her precautions, the killer found her at home. Her safe place became her tomb. The investigation revealed disturbing details. Police found a distinctive footprint outside the apartment and evidence that the killer had come prepared. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a burglary gone wrong. Someone had specifically targeted Terri McAdams, and they'd done it with calculated precision. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they began to suspect they were dealing with someone who'd done this before. The level of violence, the method of entry, and the apparent planning involved all pointed to an experienced predator. Someone who knew how to get in, do what they came to do, and get out without leaving obvious evidence. For nearly 40 years, that's exactly what happened. The case file grew thick with dead ends and false leads. Detectives retired, new ones took their places, and still, no breakthroughs were made. Terri's family held on to hope, but as the years passed, that hope began to fade. Then came 2021, and everything changed. The Arlington Police Department made a decision that would finally bring justice for Terri McAdams. They sent physical evidence from the crime scene to a lab for advanced DNA testing. The technology that existed in 1985 was primitive compared to what's available today. Back then, investigators needed large samples and often couldn't get usable results. But by 2021, scientists could extract DNA from the smallest traces of biological material. Through the use of investigative genetic genealogy, authorities identified McAdams' killer as Bernard Sharp. The process that led to this breakthrough is fascinating and represents the cutting edge of modern forensic science. First, investigators developed a DNA profile from evidence at the crime scene. When that profile was run through CODIS, the national DNA database, it came back with no matches. But that's where the new science came in. Instead of giving up, investigators turned to genetic genealogy. Here's how it works. They take the unknown DNA profile and upload it to genealogy databases that contain millions of profiles from people who've done ancestry testing. The system doesn't look for exact matches. It looks for familial relationships, distant cousins, great, uncles, anyone who shares enough DNA to suggest a family connection. In August 2023, the FBI agreed to help with the case. Their genetic genealogy team spent months building family trees, following DNA connections across generations. Slowly, they began to zero in on a suspect, Bernard Sharp. But there was a problem. Sharp was dead. This is where the story becomes truly chilling. Sharp died in November 1985 at age 29, after Arlington police said he shot and killed his wife, Denise. Just 9 months after Terri's murder, Sharp had committed what appeared to be an unrelated double murder-suicide. He killed his wife and her friend, critically wounded her cousin, then turned the gun on himself. At the time, investigators had actually questioned Sharp about Terri's murder. He lived nearby and had a history of sexual assault, but without DNA technology, they couldn't make the connection. Their investigation was still ongoing when he died, taking the truth with him to the grave. To confirm their suspicions, investigators needed DNA from Sharp himself. DNA profiling led the FBI and Arlington police to identify Bernard Sharp as the perpetrator in McAdams' killing, but they needed definitive proof. So they reached out to one of Sharp's relatives, who agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison. The results came back in August 2024, nearly 40 years after the crime. It was a match. The revelation sent shockwaves through Terri's family and the Arlington community. After decades of wondering, they finally had their answer, but it was an answer that raised even more disturbing questions. Bernard Sharp was more than a killer. He was a serial predator who'd been operating in the area for years. His history of sexual assault, combined with the calculated nature of Terri's murder, painted the picture of someone who'd likely committed other crimes that were never connected to him. When he died in that murder-suicide, he took those secrets with him. The timing is particularly haunting. Sharp killed Terri in February 1985, then continued living his life for 9 more months. He got married, maintained relationships, went to work every day, all while knowing what he'd done. Then, in November, something triggered him to kill again. This time, it was his wife and her friend who paid the price. What drove him to that final act of violence? Was he afraid he was about to be caught? Was he spiraling out of control? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Bernard Sharp was a monster who destroyed multiple lives before finally destroying himself. At the press conference announcing the breakthrough, Terri's sister Karen Hopper spoke about the long journey to this moment. Yesterday marked for us a day we had all given up hope would ever come, she said. After so many long years, we had come to accept we would probably never know who murdered our sister. She talked about how she'd always imagined it would feel better to know the killer was alive, so they could watch justice be served in court. But now, she said, there might be a blessing in not having to endure a trial after all these years. Knowing who killed Terri was enough. The case of Terri McAdams shows us something important about the nature of evil. It's not always the stranger hiding in dark alleys. Sometimes it's the neighbor who lives just down the street, the one who nods hello and seems perfectly normal. Bernard Sharp managed to hide his true nature from almost everyone around him, right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. But it also shows us the power of persistence and advancing technology. The investigators who worked this case never gave up. They kept pushing forward, trying new techniques, following new leads, even when it seemed hopeless. And that persistence, combined with cutting-edge science, finally brought answers to a family that had waited nearly 4 decades for the truth. Terri McAdams was just 22 years old when she died. She was planning a wedding, finishing college, building a life with someone she loved. All of that was taken away in one night of senseless violence. But now, finally, her family has answers. And her story serves as a reminder that justice, even when it's delayed by decades, can still find a way. If you believe stories like these deserve to be told, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Paris, Texas, August 1996. The small town, about 2 hours northeast of Dallas, was known for its replica Eiffel Tower and quiet, neighborly atmosphere. It was the kind of place where people looked out for each other, where elderly residents could feel safe in their own homes. That sense of security was shattered on the night of August 18th, when someone committed one of the most heinous crimes in the town's history. The victim was Mary Moore Searight, an 86-year-old woman with a heart as big as Texas and a legacy that would outlive her by decades. But on that terrible night, her generosity and trust would be used against her in the most brutal way imaginable. Mary wasn't just any elderly resident of Paris, a woman who'd lived an extraordinary life, dividing her time between her hometown and Austin, where she'd become something of a legend. In Austin, she'd operated livestock, fought for environmental causes, and helped found the Austin chapter of the Audubon Society. When developers came calling with multi-million-dollar offers for her land, she turned them down. She had bigger plans. Instead of cashing in, Mary donated her land to create what would become the Mary Moore Searight Metropolitan Park in South Austin. We're talking about 344 acres of fields, trees, and wildlife, complete with disc golf courses, horseback trails, and playgrounds. The city purchased 88 acres from her using a Texas Parks and Wildlife grant, and she donated an additional 206 acres. That's the kind of woman Mary was, someone who thought about legacy, about leaving the world better than she found it. But there's something else you need to know about Mary. She owned several rental properties in Paris, near her home. She was a landlord, and like many landlords, she tried to help people who were down on their luck. She rented to folks who might have trouble finding housing elsewhere. It was another expression of her generous spirit. Unfortunately, it would also be what killed her. Living in one of those rental properties, right next door to Mary, was a 25-year-old man named David Paul Cady Jr. Cady probably seemed like just another young tenant trying to get by, but investigators would later discover that he was something much more dangerous. On the night of August 18th, 1996, Mary's unofficial caretaker made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Mary was found badly beaten and strangled inside her home by her unofficial caretaker, but she was still alive, clinging to life despite her horrific injuries. She was airlifted to a hospital in Dallas, where she fought for 3 more days before succumbing to her injuries on August 21st. The scene at Mary's house was devastating. She'd been sexually assaulted and beaten with such ferocity that it was clear her attacker had intended to kill her. The fact that this 86-year-old woman had survived the initial attack and held on for 3 more days speaks to the incredible strength and will to live that had defined her entire life. Investigators immediately canvassed the area, looking for witnesses and potential suspects. They didn't have to look far. Among her tenants was David Paul Cady Jr., 25 years old at the time, who became a person of interest after investigators noted an unexplained laceration on his right hand. When detectives interviewed Cady on the evening of the crime, something didn't feel right. During interviews, Cady offered inconsistent explanations for his injury. Here was a young man who lived next door to the victim, and he had a fresh cut on his hand that he couldn't properly explain. Red flags were going up all over the place. But the investigators were thorough. DNA swabs were collected from Cady's hand, and they began building their case. The problem was, this was 1996. DNA technology wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. The swabs were collected and tested, but there were no major breakthroughs. Without definitive DNA evidence, the case began to stall. Investigators had their suspicions about Cady, but suspicion isn't enough to secure a conviction. They needed hard evidence, and the technology of the time wasn't giving them what they needed. As months turned to years, the case went cold. For Mary's family and the Paris community, this was devastating. Here was a woman who dedicated her life to helping others, who'd given away millions of dollars worth of land to create a public park, and her killer was walking free. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. But investigators never gave up. They kept the evidence, hoping that someday technology would advance enough to give them the answers they needed. That day finally came in 2021. In 2021, Searight's case was identified by the Texas Rangers as being eligible for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative program. This federally funded program was designed specifically to solve cold cases like Mary's, using advanced DNA testing and investigative techniques that simply hadn't existed when the crime was committed. The process began with re-examining all the physical evidence from the case. The DNA swabs that had been taken from Cady's hand in 1996 were still in evidence storage, perfectly preserved. In 2023, Katie's DNA was also submitted to the program, and Searight's DNA was found on the swabs from his hand. Let that sink in for a moment. For 27 years, Katie had been walking around as a free man, knowing what he'd done to marry more Searight. He'd gone on with his life, gotten older, possibly committed other crimes we don't know about, all while Mary's family wondered if her killer would ever be brought to justice. In February 2024, he was arrested, though he was already in the Hopkins County Jail for another crime. He was arrested and indicted by a Lamar County grand jury on December 12, 2024, nearly 30 years after Searight's death. The arrest brought a mix of emotions for Mary's family and friends. Relief that her killer had finally been identified, but also anger that it had taken so long. How many other elderly or vulnerable people had Katie encountered over the years? Had there been other victims? These are questions that may never be answered. What we do know is that Mary Moore Searight trusted her tenant. She probably never imagined that the young man living next door, the one she was trying to help by providing affordable housing, would be the one to brutally assault and murder her. It's a tragic reminder that sometimes our greatest vulnerabilities come from our willingness to help others. The case also highlights the incredible advances in DNA technology over the past 3 decades. Evidence that was essentially useless in 1996 became the key to solving the case in 2024. The same swabs that couldn't provide definitive answers 28 years ago now clearly showed Mary's DNA on her killer's hand. Think about what this means for other cold cases. How many unsolved murders and assaults from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s could be solved with today's technology? How many families are still waiting for answers that might already be sitting in evidence storage somewhere? Katie was arrested in February 2024 and remains in custody, finally facing justice for what he did to Mary Moore Searight. But the real tragedy here isn't just the loss of one generous woman's life. It's the decades of injustice that followed, the years her family spent not knowing who was responsible, and the possibility that Katie may have hurt others in the intervening years. Mary Moore Searight's legacy lives on in the beautiful park that bears her name in Austin. Thousands of people enjoy that space every year, many of them probably unaware of the remarkable woman who made it possible. She was someone who believed in making the world a better place, even when it meant sacrificing her own financial gain. But now, finally, she has another kind of legacy: justice. Her case stands as a testament to the power of modern forensic science and the determination of investigators who refuse to let cold cases stay cold. After 28 years, Mary Moore Searight can rest in peace, knowing that her killer has been brought to account for his crimes. The story of Mary's murder also serves as a sobering reminder about the nature of trust and vulnerability. Here was a woman who opened her heart and her properties to help others, and that generosity was repaid with violence. It's a tragedy that shouldn't discourage us from helping others, but it should remind us to be cautious about who we trust with our safety. April 19th, 1982, Odessa, Texas. The Permian Mall was bustling with shoppers, and among the employees closing up for the day was 64-year-old Velma Nesset. Velma was the kind of worker every employer dreams of having: reliable, punctual, and hardworking. For months, she'd walked the same route to and from work every day, a routine that had become as familiar as breathing. But on this particular spring evening, that routine would be shattered by an act of violence so brutal it would haunt investigators for over 4 decades. Velma wasn't just any mall employee. At 64, she could have been retired, enjoying her golden years, but she chose to keep working. Maybe she needed the money, or maybe she just enjoyed the social interaction that came with the job. Either way, she was a fixture at the mall, someone her coworkers could count on to show up every day with a smile and a strong work ethic. Her routine was simple and predictable. Every morning, she'd walk from her home to the Permian Mall. Every evening, she'd make the same walk back. It wasn't a particularly long distance, and for an active woman like Velma, it was probably a pleasant way to get some exercise and save money on gas. In 1982, Odessa felt like a safe place for an older woman to walk alone. That sense of security would prove to be tragically misplaced. When Velma didn't show up for work the next day, her coworkers immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like her at all. She was dependable to a fault, the kind of person who'd call in if she was going to be even a few minutes late. When she didn't arrive and didn't call, panic set in. Her family and coworkers began searching for her, retracing the route she would have taken home from the mall. During the search, the partially nude body of Velma was discovered in a drainage culvert. She had been murdered. She had been attacked on her walk to work. The discovery was devastating. Velma Nesset had been sexually assaulted and killed, then left in that culvert like discarded trash. Someone had targeted this hardworking woman, a grandmother who was just trying to make her way home from another day at the mall, and they'd committed an act of violence that defied comprehension. The scene told a story of pure brutality. Velma had fought for her life. The evidence suggested she'd been overpowered and dragged to that culvert, where her attacker had sexually assaulted her before killing her. It was the kind of crime that shakes a community to its core, because if it could happen to someone like Velma, a woman who was just walking home from work on a regular Tuesday evening, then it could happen to anyone. The Odessa Police Department threw everything they had at the case. In 1982, they didn't have much, but they were determined to find Velma's killer. They canvassed the area, interviewed potential witnesses, and followed every lead they could find. Then something happened that seemed like a breakthrough. A man was arrested in the slaying and confessed to killing Nesset, but was acquitted in a 1983 trial due to a false confession and lack of evidence. Think about how frustrating that must have been for investigators and for Velma's family. Here was someone who actually confessed to the crime, but when it went to trial, the evidence didn't hold up. The confession was determined to be false, and the real killer remained free. This is more common than you might think in high-profile cases. Sometimes people confess to crimes they didn't commit, either for attention because they're mentally ill or because they've been coerced. In this case, an innocent man had been put through the trauma of a murder trial while the real killer was still out there. For decades, that's where the case stood. There weren't any breakthroughs on the case until almost 40 years later. Velma's family grew older. Some probably passed away, all of them carrying the pain of not knowing who had killed their loved one or why. The investigators who worked the original case retired, taking their institutional knowledge with them. New detectives would occasionally review the file, but without new evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. But the Texas Rangers never forgot about Velma Nesset. Nesset's case became eligible for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative program in 2020. This federally funded program has been a game changer for cold cases across the state, using advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy to solve crimes that have been cold for decades. The process of solving Velma's case involved cutting-edge science that would have seemed like magic to the investigators working the case in 1982. Scientists were able to extract DNA from evidence that had been stored for nearly 40 years, create genetic profiles, and then use genealogy databases to trace family connections across multiple generations. The investigation led them to Billy Wayne Ludwigson. In July 2020, the Texas Rangers and Odessa Police Department arrested Ludwigson in Denver, Colorado. He was arrested by Colorado authorities in July of 2020 and subsequently extradited to Texas that October. When confronted with the evidence against him, Ludwigson confessed to Nesset's murder. After 38 years of denying involvement, lying to investigators, and living as a free man while Velma's family suffered, he finally admitted what he'd done. The confession must have been both a relief and a source of rage for everyone involved in the case. Finally, they had their answer. But it also meant that for nearly 4 decades, Billy Wayne Ludwigson had been walking free, knowing what he'd done to Velma Nesset. How many nights had he slept peacefully while her family lay awake, wondering who had killed their loved one? On August 9th, 2024, the now 62-year-old Ludwigson pled guilty and was sentenced to 20 years confinement in a Texas Department of Criminal Justice prison. At 62 years old, this sentence likely means Ludwigson will spend the rest of his life behind bars, finally paying for what he did to Velma Nesset in 1982. But here's what really gets me about this case. Ludwigson was living in Colorado when he was arrested. That means he'd been free to move around the country, to start over wherever he wanted, to build a new life, while Velma's body lay in a grave and her family lived with unanswered questions. How many other women might he have encountered over the years? Did he commit other crimes that we don't know about? These are haunting questions that may never be fully answered. The technology that solved this case is truly remarkable. Think about it. Investigators took biological evidence that was collected in 1982, before personal computers were common, before the internet existed, before DNA profiling was even invented. That evidence sat in storage for 38 years, waiting for science to catch up. When it finally did, it spoke as clearly as if Velma herself was pointing at her killer. The case also highlights the importance of never giving up on cold cases. The Texas Rangers could have easily written this off as unsolvable. The original investigators had tried their best, even gotten a confession that turned out to be false, but they'd hit a dead end. It would have been understandable if the case had just been filed away and forgotten. But someone kept pushing. Someone believed that Velma Nesset deserved justice, even if it took 40 years to get it. That persistence, combined with advancing technology and adequate funding for cold case investigations, finally brought the truth to light. There's something particularly cruel about crimes against people like Velma Nesset. She was just trying to live her life, to work hard and support herself, to walk home safely after a day at the mall. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous or risky. She was exactly the kind of person who should have been safe on the streets of her own community. But Billy Wayne Ludwigson saw her as prey, as someone he could overpower and victimize for his own twisted gratification. The randomness of it all is terrifying. Velma probably never saw it coming. She was walking the same route she'd walked dozens of times before, thinking about her day or planning her evening, when suddenly her life was turned into a nightmare. It's the kind of crime that reminds us how fragile our safety really is, how quickly a normal day can become the worst day of our lives. But there's also hope in this story. Hope that justice, even when it's delayed by decades, can still find a way. Hope that advancing technology will help solve other cold cases that have been sitting in evidence storage for years. Hope that families who've been waiting for answers might finally get the closure they deserve. For the people who knew and loved Velma Nesset, the arrest and conviction of Billy Wayne Ludwigson probably brought a mix of emotions. Relief that her killer had finally been caught, anger that it took so long, sadness that Velma never lived to see justice done. But hopefully, there was also some peace in knowing that her case hadn't been forgotten, that investigators had never stopped trying to find the truth. Today, Velma's story stands as a testament to the power of persistence and the promise of advancing forensic science. Her death was a tragedy that couldn't be undone, but her case has helped pave the way for solving other cold cases across Texas and beyond. In that sense, even in death, Velma Nesset has contributed something important to the cause of justice. These three cases, Terri McAdams, Mary Moore Searight, and Velma Nesset, represent more than just individual tragedies. They represent a revolution in how we solve crimes, how we think about justice, and how we honor the memory of victims who can no longer speak for themselves. But there's also something extraordinary about the people who refused to let these cases die. The investigators who kept pushing forward when leads dried up. The family members who never stopped asking questions. The scientists who developed new technologies that could extract answers from decades-old evidence. The funding programs that made it possible to apply these new techniques to cold cases. The Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, which helped solve both Mary's and Velma's cases, is a perfect example of how targeted funding and advanced science can work together to achieve justice. This federally funded program has been a game-changer for cold cases across Texas and beyond, proving that investment in forensic science pays dividends in solved cases and closure for families. But perhaps the most important lesson from these cases is that evil often hides in plain sight. Bernard Sharp was Terry's neighbor. David Paul Cady Jr. was Mary's tenant. Billy Wayne Ludwigson was just another face in the crowd in Odessa. None of them fit the stereotype of a dangerous predator lurking in dark alleys. They were people who lived normal-looking lives while harboring the capacity for horrific violence. This should serve as a reminder to all of us to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right about someone. It should also remind us that the justice system, while imperfect, has the capacity to evolve and improve. The same cases that seemed hopeless in the 80s and 90s have been solved using techniques that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. Looking forward, there are probably hundreds or thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence storage across Texas and the rest of the country, waiting for science to advance enough to solve them. Cases where families are still waiting for answers, where killers are still walking free, where justice has been delayed but not necessarily denied. The stories of Terri, Mary, and Velma give us hope that those cases too might someday be solved. That advancing technology, persistent investigators, and adequate funding can continue to bring closure to families and accountability to killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder. These women deserved more than what happened to them. We can't rewrite their stories, but we can honor them by remembering their lives and the justice that finally came.